It's great to see you. Thanks so much for coming. Although I know I've already rattled some cages with the mere suggestion that brands are somehow failing Gen Z, thank you. But stand by, I promise to give you a few perspectives on this and a few pieces of data and even some takeaway tools to support such a brash suggestion. I head up the Unstereotype Alliance at UN Women, which is a global action platform that seeks to eliminate harmful stereotypes from all advertising and media content. It's a global movement of 240 organisations like advertisers, creative agencies and media platforms that recognise advertising content can shape perceptions of society and drive social change by depicting positive representations of all people. We work to empower people in all their diversity, so race, age, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, language, education, and socio-economic status. And we do address the full gender spectrum, so not just women and girls being convened by UN Women, but LGBTIQ+ through to healthy masculinities. Which is why we were so excited to track the emergence of Gen Z, which doesn't even like to be labelled Gen Z, right? Because labels in general are offensive, pigeonholes are reductive, and static gender identities shouldn't even be a thing. We get it. Gen Z has been touted as the first gender-fluid generation. And as the Unstereotype Alliance rejects stereotypes and any label that reduces entire groups of people to simplistic, often biased characteristics, we embraced this emerging generation that we shall call Gen Z for the sake of today as the most progressive generation of all time. And yet, there are disturbing trends that contradict this narrative. They have far more consequential impacts than offensive labelling, and brands can definitely play a role in perpetuating them. This is what we call the Gen Z gender paradox, but elsewhere it's been called the new global gender divide. Young men and young women's worldviews are pulling apart. The consequences could be far-reaching. You might have read in a recent piece in the Financial Times that talked about one of the most well-established patterns in measuring public opinion, which is that every generation tends to move as one in terms of its politics and general ideologies. Its members share the same formative experiences, the same key milestones at the same time in their lives, and they intermingle in the same spaces. With Gen Z, however, they can be hyper-progressive on certain issues, but surprisingly conservative or traditional on others. The FT claims that Gen Z is undergoing a great gender divergence, with young women far more progressive and young men more conservative. Gen Z is two generations, they say, not one. In countries on every continent, this ideological gap has opened up between young men and women. They no longer see eye to eye. In the US, Gallup data shows that for decades, young men and women were each spread roughly equally across liberal and conservative worldviews. Now, women aged 18 to 30 are 30 percentage points more liberal than their male peers. That gap took just 6 years to open up. And it's not just happening here. In the UK, there is now a 25-point gap between increasingly conservative young men and progressive female peers. And in Germany, the gap is 30 percentage points. Outside the West, there are even more stark divisions, including South Korea. I'll just catch up on my slide, there we go. Where there's a yawning chasm in South Korea between men and women, and it's a pattern we're seeing repeating in China and Africa. And in every country, this dramatic split is either exclusive to Gen Z or it's far more pronounced than among men and women in their 30s and older. The Unstereotype Alliance and UN Women conduct a biennial survey called the Gender Equality Attitude Study. And sadly, we've identified the same ideological split over the last few years. When you consider how that scales up and manifests in our communities, it becomes clear why we have to work so hard to eliminate gender-based stereotypes. Now, You might be asking yourself, what is going on with Gen Z? What is it that is driving this gap, these divergent attitudes and beliefs of what is supposed to be such a progressive generation, especially when it comes to gender? How have those views not been left in the past? In short, they definitely have not. We conduct the Gender Equality Attitudes Study across 20 countries, and our data also shows that archaic attitudes towards gender equality still prevail. While 9 in 10 people agree that equal pay for equal work is important to their country's future success, 40% of male respondents agree that a man's job is to earn money while a woman's job is to look after the house and family. 51% of men agree that women should work less and devote more time to caring for their family, and 19% of all respondents believe that there are acceptable circumstances for someone to hit their spouse or partner. Of greatest concern is the fact that these views are held most fervently among cohorts of younger men, particularly those aged 16 to 19. Traditional perceptions of gender are not dying out with older generations. What's more, they are being actively propagated amongst our young Gen Z men right across the globe. So what is happening here? The Me Too movement certainly was key as a trigger, giving rise to fiercely feminist values amongst young women who suddenly felt empowered to speak out against long-running injustices. 7 years on, the clear divides on fundamental gender equality issues like sexual harassment has pushed young men and women into conservative and liberal camps, respectively, on many other issues. And the proliferation of smartphones and social media means that young men and women now increasingly inhabit separate social spaces, and they experience separate cultures. We started to dig deeper, and there is a clear picture emerging. Men and boys are receiving many conflicting and unhealthy messages. They're feeling the pressure, and they're lacking positive role models. And that has opened up a new and dangerous gap in the market, which predatory manfluencers have stepped right into, and they're making it so much worse. Their stereotypical toxic messages about what it means to be a successful man are harming our young men. They're suffering poor mental health, and suicide is now the leading cause of death for men under the age of 50. This is a serious problem. Our young men today are not okay. So what does this have to do with brands? Certainly in advertising, portrayals of masculinity in the media and advertising content have become monolithic. The impact is widespread and it's significant, particularly for brands when you consider that young men and boys are notoriously hard to reach, right? So once you have their attention, you have a responsibility and a duty of care with what you say to them. If you consider advertising as an inspirational vision of what we could all aspire to be, what role models are we presenting to young men? What does it mean to be a man in 2024? Let's take a look.
How do men see success? Cars, bars, boats? No, not boats. Yachts. Lots and lots and lots of money, of honeys. Don't be funny, being fast. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Martini. Shaken, not stirred. Never, ever stirred. Always tough. Triceps, biceps, pecs. Sex, lots and lots and lots of sex. Lots of success. Business, excess, careless, hairless, fearless, joyless, heartless, expressionless, humorless, relentless, emotionless, soulless success.
So our Alliance member, New Macho at BBD Perfect Storm in London, made that video. And they also conducted a survey in the US and the UK called The Price of Success. I suggest you take a look at it. They gathered the opinions from 4,000 men aged 18 to 75 years old. 66% of millennial men told them that advertising and the media have a negative impact on how successful they feel. This means that advertising and the media are making that many men feel worse about themselves. This finding was mirrored in younger Gen Z cohorts and tracks with the upward trajectory of stats that you saw there in the rising rates of poor mental health in young men. And when we apply an intersectional lens, with all the many layers of misrepresentation and bias that comes with race, for example, the picture gets worse for consumers and for brands. A report from Adweekly last month found that 70% of Black Gen Z consumers here in the US say that racial identity has increasingly become a central aspect of their self-identity, compared to just 39% of non-Black consumers. 42% of Black Gen Z consumers say they're more likely to buy from brands that actively confront and challenge racial and ethnic stereotypes. And yet, 31% of all Black Gen Z consumers are dissatisfied with how they and their lives are portrayed in advertising. So advertising and progressive storytelling has a huge role and opportunity to play in changing this narrative for business and for good, which is why we exist. So the Unstereotype Alliance was founded to address one of the most common defaults employed in advertising creative to quickly land an idea or a character: stereotypes. It's critical to consider the impact of this because advertising is such a far-reaching ecosystem supported by billions of dollars. It influences consumers' views and perceptions all over the world of themselves and the society around them. On the flip side, progressive and inclusive advertising can obviously help create an enormous amount of good and drive positive social change. To be clear, a stereotype is an idea that undermines, where have we gone? There we go. That undermines a group of people in wider culture. And it's generally accepted and propagated by many, even if it isn't true or grounded in any kind of reality. Stereotypes stand back to back with discrimination, and they act as a barrier to progress in any society. If we think about stereotypes as a kind of gateway belief, because they have a strong relationship with prejudice and discrimination, which is why they're so destructive in our societies. Stereotypes inform prejudices because they give us the baseline for having certain feelings about different groups of people. These prejudices then inform discrimination because we start to act in a way that excludes or lessens opportunities for whole groups of people. And that's a big deal from a human rights perspective, because when we diminish and disregard whole groups of people, this leads to real-life consequences, like reduced education and employment opportunities, poor economic and health outcomes, discriminatory policy decisions, and denial of individual rights, like bodily autonomy. Ultimately, stereotypes create harmful norms that contravene the right to live a fully empowered and decent life. And they're culturally driven, so they show up differently all around the world, which is why the Unstereotype Alliance has 12 national chapters across 5 continents, and they all act as our agents for change on the ground to tackle local stereotypes at a local level. But of course, tackling stereotypes is always easier said than done. And as with most things, it's uncertainty that immobilises us. Last year at Cannes Lions, we launched a global campaign to mobilise public action against stereotypes by reaching, educating and engaging the billions of consumers that our members serve. Say Nothing, Change Nothing was aimed at Gen Z, and it encouraged people to be active upstanders, not bystanders, when they see stereotypes in action. Like any good campaign, we started with consumer insights and conducted a global survey to understand what it is that holds people back from speaking up against stereotypes. While 3 out of 4 people say they regularly do see and hear stereotypes in action, 50% don't speak up or disagree because they don't want to escalate the situation. And 41% of people don't know how to intervene. They don't know what to say or how to call out stereotypes in a safe way. And so they say nothing. The problem is that if we keep seeing these stereotypes around us, reflected back at us, not only do we change nothing, but we become desensitized to them and we normalize them. So you can imagine when these outdated attitudes proliferate in advertising and media content, it becomes clear why it's so crucial that we eradicate harmful stereotypes. And yet, our gender equality attitude study, which is sounding like a pretty big downer of a report at this point, but it is absolutely so vital in terms of the insights. 68% of people believe the media portrays women in traditional roles. So wife, mother, homemaker, caregiver. And 73% believe that men are still depicted in traditional roles as business leaders, providers, decision makers. Now, if portrayals shape perceptions, and we think of advertising and the media as drivers of social attitudes and beliefs, what impact do you think this is having in the fight for gender equality? And if you're thinking, well, that's a really binary analysis, and Gen Z is a gender-fluid generation, no wonder this doesn't resonate with them. We test thousands of ads from some of the world's most progressive brands with our unstereotyped metric. And in 2023, only 3% of them featured characters from the LGBTIQ+ community. And that's not the only community woefully underrepresented in ads. Just 1% of ads featured someone living with a disability, yet 15% of the world lives with either a physical or mental disability. That is not a minority. These are the outdated attitudes that proliferate still in advertising and media content. This is what Gen Z sees reflected back at them as the world they live in. It's not inclusive, it's not diverse, it's not progressive. No wonder there's a paradox. No wonder they're divided. So what can you do as content creators and as brands? You have the power to drive the change in our communities through progressive and inclusive advertising that features authentic portrayals of all people. You have the power to shift cultures and normalize equality of all kinds, empowering people of all genders and generations. Now here's the takeaways I promised. Safely confronting and addressing stereotypes is hard. In your own life, at your Thanksgiving table with your homophobic uncle, in your sexist workplace and your racist boss. We get it. And so as part of our Say Nothing, Change Nothing campaign, we created the Unstereotype 101 guide because we want to empower people to feel safe about speaking up. It's aimed at Gen Z, but can be used by anyone, so please do grab the QR code and check it out. But if we're ever going to address the Gen Z paradox and close the gender divide that is throwing this demographic into reverse, there are a few things you need to think about as advertisers, as content creators, as employers, as responsible communicators. Number one, reject the expected. And that's what stereotypes are, right? They are expected portrayals of people. They have been done to death. Open the aperture on your brand view of the world. Reflect that back to your Gen Z consumers. Surprise them. Be brave. Number two, create new visual narratives and new stories of success. You have an opportunity to engage young men by creating positive depictions of healthy masculinities at scale, and it's urgently needed. Allow them to show emotion in your creative, to change expression, to have friendships and healthy relationships, to be vulnerable. Show diverse depictions of beauty, of aspirational life goals, of what love looks like across the gender spectrum in more dynamic and innovative ways. Introduce new role models and be super intentional with your brand partnerships, because when authentic brand and influencer partnerships are built, When you introduce more interesting role models, diverse messaging starts to emerge into the world. Your consumers feel seen and represented with authenticity, which leads to new and inspiring conversations that will benefit your brand as well. And finally, ensure that diverse Gen Z voices are at every table and that they are heard. Nothing about us without us is a feminist mantra that frankly still falls on deaf ears, but when it comes to your Gen Z consumer audiences, ignore it at your peril. Who makes the work is who shows up in the work, right? And if your brand is to speak with any authenticity to Gen Z, you need representation from across Gen Z on your team. Every colour, every religion, every stop on the gender spectrum of the communities you serve. And if your agency teams do not reflect this diversity, insist upon it. You should not walk into another presentation where there is either no diversity or token diversity around the table. Insist on it up front when you pitch your account, when you're doing your annual planning, bake it into your creative briefs. Because change comes from where the money comes from. And you have a right and a responsibility to dictate the terms of doing business with your brand. So that is my challenge to you, and where we ask for your help to drive the change we all need to see, which you have the power and the influence to create for the health of all generations, for the fight for gender equality, and the progress of the marketing industry. Thank you. Minutes early, yeah. Are there any questions? Olivia said that I'm allowed to take questions, which I'm very happy to do. No? Great. Yeah, at the back. I think there's a microphone coming.
Hello, I'm Jules. I'm with Kipling, the brand, and I'm just curious if you have any examples of brands doing this well right now. We know we have a lot of work to do, so just want to get some inspiration from others.
Yeah, for sure. We're very lucky to have 240 parent companies really that have a lot of brands beneath them that have been working on a lot of these things a long time. So Unilever is one of the vice chairs actually of the Unstereotype Alliance, but also Mars, Mondelez, Diageo. And there's a couple of things that they do incredibly well, and they're learning all the time, and they're not afraid to try different approaches, to test and course correct. So one of the things they've been doing recently, especially since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, when the ad industry suddenly had this epiphany that, we're very white and male and we need to become more diverse, they developed ERGs. And so if they can't afford, especially if you're a small agency or a small brand or a startup, if you can't afford to employ a really diverse and representative staff or team, then you approach or you create advisory groups, not the one black guy on your team or the one Muslim woman, right? It's not their job to help you become more inclusive and to have all the answers, but to develop advisory groups that you can call on to sense check your work, to check for unconscious bias. Because we will recognise, women watch an ad, right? Just even at that level, women watch an ad or assess a piece of work. We know when we're not in it. We immediately recognise that, none of the women have a speaking role in this ad, or the woman's just doing the cooking, or the one guy that's in the ad is being portrayed as stupid and incompetent, which is where we used to be when we would put guys in laundry ads or whatever. So it's putting those groups together and those advisory bodies, I guess, that they can call on and sense check the work every step of the way. They test their advertising if they can afford it before going to market, and then they take the learnings and build that into their brief. So it's a constantly iterative process that's growing and improving all the time. And I think really great examples of that is what Unilever's been doing with Dove and Men Care, when we're particularly looking, Dove Men and Care, sorry, when we're looking at portrayals of masculinity, something that Diageo, an alcohol manufacturer, but you've got to fish where the fish are, right? And they have a really large male consumer base, particularly younger men as well. So they've been really invested in analysing the messaging and the visual narratives that they put out when they're communicating with young men, really taking responsibility for their role in that conversation. So those are a couple of examples I'd give. Thanks for the question. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alina, and I am a part of the external D&I board for Nivea. So one of those, people that they hire outside to help counsel with some of these issues. I was also part of Cassandra, the trend forecasting report, when we saw 10 years ago that for the first time, young boys at the age of 8 and 10 had less hope of the future than women for the first time. So this was something that, all of us watching trends are kind of like expecting to happen. My question to you is, beyond marketers, what do you see the role of organizations and the education system in raising this new generation of men, young men, not just the ones right now, because when we're seeing this is starting from a very early age, and we know there's a pushback on education. So that's, my question to you. What do you think the role of education is in this issue? Thank you.
Education's everything, right? I talk about the circling of the wagons in terms of every touch point. I mean, as brands, and I'm ex-agency for years and years, we always look at all the consumer touch points, but now we're looking at that throughout a lifetime. And the big difference is that even little kids, it's not just parking them in front of a TV anymore and they're absorbing these messages. They've got it in the palm of their hand. And they are absorbing messages that their parents can't police or censor or whatever you want to call it. And we all know that as humans, we're now absorbing, tens of thousands of messages subliminally a day. So if you've got a fresh little mind with lots of room in it to take in new thoughts and observations, education's everything. And not just for boys. I think I literally had this conversation the other night. I heard I'm from New Zealand, but I heard the new Australian of the Year speak, and she made the film Embrace, which is about body positivity of boys, girls, everyone across the spectrum. And the impact of social media has completely changed the game. I don't need to tell you that. It's changed our entire industry long ago. But helping kids to process that information, helping them to develop their own filters of the messages they're receiving, and then helping them to, what's the mantra they have? Mute, block, delete, repeat. When those messages get toxic, rather than absorbing them and having it create such harm, because that's where we're seeing this develop, right? It's getting them in the mental health before anything else. This is what we're seeing happen. So it's helping kids develop those skills as well, to recognise what they're seeing and kind of filter those influences for themselves. And then on that, when we talk about the circling of the wagons, it's brands, it's education, it's influencers. And as brands, that's a whole new wave of either support or contrarians that we can't necessarily control what they're going to say, but they can certainly provide a really powerful voice. And that's why we say you need to be really intentional with who you partner with as brands, again, especially with little kids, because they're soaking it all up. All right? Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference. The program looks great, so thank you so much.
Thank you for such a powerful start to this afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you.